The flight deck of the USS Ronald Reagan was already humming with tension by 0620. Jets stood ready for launch, their canopies reflecting streaks of morning light through the haze rolling. Off the Pacific, crew members moved with trained precision, pushing ordnance carts, running pre-flight checks on T-45 Goshawks, and coordinating launch sequencing from the tower. Everything was smooth, crisp, and exactly on schedule. Lieutenant Commander Clara Monroe stood near the forward edge of the island, her flight deck jersey tucked immaculately beneath her float coat. Clipboard in hand, she tracked each aircraft's readiness against the manifest. Her expression was unreadable, calm but laser-focused. Everyone aboard knew her reputation: tight-lipped, precise, reliable, not warm, but always on point. And on this carrier, during flight ops, that mattered more than being liked. By 0631, pre-launch checks were complete. Monroe gave a nod to the deck boss and stepped aside to signal the final go. Then the mood shifted. A pair of Marines in full gear emerged from the superstructure entrance, walking deliberately across the deck. That alone wasn't unusual. MPs sometimes appeared for crew movement enforcement or security escort, but this time they were coming for her. Monroe spotted them and didn't flinch. She adjusted her stance, squared her shoulders, and waited. Around her, movement slowed. Sailors paused mid-task. The launch team froze by the catapults. A junior airman carrying a radio headset took one slow step back. Nobody said a word. The taller MP stopped just in front of her and spoke firmly. "Lieutenant Commander Monroe, you're to stand down. You're coming with us." He didn't raise his voice, didn't offer context. His eyes stayed fixed just above hers. The second MP pulled a set of handcuffs from a pouch on his belt and held them, low, just out of view from the main tower cameras. Clara handed her clipboard to a startled petty officer without hesitation. She turned, slowly, placing her hands behind her back with precision. The cuffs closed around her wrists with a heavy metallic click that sounded louder than the jet engines in the background. The MP reached to her neck, unclipping her access badge, and with surgical focus, snapped it in half. The halves fell to the deck, unnoticed by the airman who now stood staring at his boots. From the Combat Information Center 2 levels down, the radar officer raised his head at 0633 and muttered a tight warning. "Contact. 6 new vessels approaching fast from bearing 330, requesting ID." No response. The bridge watched in disbelief as 6 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers appeared. On the screen, they moved into formation around the Reagan and her escorts, holding a wide defensive perimeter, tight, silent, and unflagged. Captain Harrington stood on the bridge, his hand gripping the edge of the plotting table. He hadn't authorized any formation maneuvers. No notifications had come from 7th Fleet. He looked down at the tactical screen, then back through the bridge glass toward the flight deck below, where Monroe was now being led away. On deck, nobody said it aloud, but the confusion was sharp. Monroe was not someone they associated with threats or mistakes. She didn't bend protocol. She was the very definition of it. And that made this spectacle all the more jarring. As she was walked across the steel expanse toward the hatch, eyes followed. Some stared. Some deliberately turned away. No one moved to help her. No one asked questions. The aircraft handlers stood frozen near Catapult 2, the yellow shirts still gripping batons, the brown shirts watching from beside parked aircraft. One petty officer removed his cranial headset as if he were about to speak, but then thought better of it. The 2 Marines walked her down the ladder and into the ship's interior, their steps echoing in the hollow chamber as the flight deck sealed behind them. By 0639, the destroyers had taken up a hexagonal screen, each holding position exactly 1,000 yards off the Reagan's flanks. They responded to no hails. IFF signals were dark. CIC confirmed that they weren't part of any scheduled exercise. They simply appeared and waited. On the bridge, Harrington finally broke the silence. "Bring up her full record. Security clearance, prior assignments, all of it. And flag ONI immediately." His voice was sharp, precise, the kind of tone you use when instinct overrides procedure. Below deck, Monroe walked with deliberate calm. Her face betrayed nothing. No fear, no anger, but her eyes scanned every corridor. She walked like someone taking inventory. The MPs remained silent, flanking her just far enough apart to control both sides. Every sailor who passed gave the same double take. A senior officer in cuffs. No explanation, no words exchanged. Just the quiet presence of order turned upside down. At 0644, she was placed in a secure holding room 2 decks below CIC. The door closed behind her, sealed with a hiss. On the outside, the MPs stood at attention. Inside, Clara stood alone in the sterile glow of bright lights, cuffs still on, her shadow sharp against the white bulkheads. She sat slowly on the steel bench attached to the wall, breathing through her nose, She didn't shake. She didn't speak. But behind her eyes, a storm had already started, and far above, on the command deck of the closest destroyer, someone finally lifted a receiver and spoke into a secured channel. Confirm position. Awaiting authentication. Mission clock now active. 0647. Captain is aboard. Initiate Phase 2. The walls of the holding room were painted in a colorless shade of institutional white, the kind that blurred time and intention. A fixed metal bench ran along one side, bolted to the deck. Overhead, the lighting hummed low and steady, harsh against the silence. Lieutenant Commander Clara Monroe sat with her back straight, hands resting on her knees, watching the door. She had been in the room for over 30 minutes by the time the medic arrived. He entered without eye contact, carrying a small field diagnostic kit in a thin plastic case. He wore standard Navy scrubs and a name badge, but Clara noticed the badge was turned inward on the lanyard. He didn't speak right away, just unwrapped a sterile tourniquet and began preparing his equipment on the counter near the door. Clara watched him for a moment before speaking. "You're here to draw blood." The medic gave a tight nod. "Orders, ma'am." He unwrapped a wristband from the case and placed it next to a labeled vial. Clara caught the number printed in black along the band. It was wrong, not just a digit off, completely incorrect. "That's not my service number," she said, her voice low but firm. The medic froze for half a second. Then he reached for the tourniquet again, pretending not to hear. Clara didn't press. She extended her arm, allowing the blood draw to continue, her eyes fixed on the incorrect band. He labeled the vial and placed the band around it without placing it on her wrist. He still hadn't looked at her. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, then quickly left the room. Clara shifted slightly on the bench, her posture still composed, but something deep inside had begun to unravel. She'd been assigned to the Ronald Reagan for just over 2 years. Her role as flight operations officer gave her oversight of every sortie, every crew cycle, every asset. She was known for precision, for never deviating from regulation. If something was off, she noticed that band was off. She looked up at the small window built into the door, a thick pane of reinforced glass, and beyond it, a sliver of the adjacent control space. From her angle, she could see part of a radar display. The 6 destroyers were still there, still holding position in that silent formation. She had never seen anything like it. No call signs, no transponders, no flag. Just a perfect hexagon, encircling the Reagan like a cage. The air in the room felt thinner now. She rose, stretching briefly, then crossed to the small sink in the corner. Cold water sputtered from the tap, and she splashed her face once, letting the droplets drip onto the collar of her flight suit. When she looked up into the polished metal above the sink, she saw her own reflection, and the scar. It ran just above her right brow, thin and faint now, a line from a childhood fall. At least, that was the story. But looking at it now, something about that explanation felt less certain. She reached up and touched it, fingertips resting gently along the raised skin. A strange warmth pulsed beneath her skin, not painful, but present. She had always dismissed it. A minor accident, a clumsy moment near a dock ladder when she was 9. She had never remembered it clearly. But now, the touch sent a tremor through her thoughts. She blinked and saw an image, too quick to hold, of a room, beige walls, a surgical tray, and a man in a green uniform nodding silently before stepping away. She opened her eyes again and was staring at herself, but something felt misaligned. She stepped back from the sink and returned to the bench, breathing evenly. Her thoughts raced through every file, every personnel record she had reviewed over the years. Her clearance allowed her to access air wing rosters, tactical orders, even secure fleet communications during alerts. But she had never been read into anything remotely resembling this. The destroyers, the silence, the lack of charges, the wristband, and now, the scar that hummed with something she couldn't explain. It wasn't fear she felt, it was a shift, a sensation like a door creaking open at the far end of a hallway she didn't know existed. She had trained to suppress emotion, to think under pressure, to operate without question until the moment for judgment arrived. That discipline was the reason her division respected her. Even if few liked her, she didn't join in off-hours poker nights. She didn't gossip in the ready room. She ran a tight air schedule, made calls that kept crews safe, and logged every deviation with precision. She wasn't warm, but she was right. That had always been enough. Now, it wasn't because something about this was personal, and she didn't understand how or why. At 0717, she looked back through the door's window again. The radar screen still glowed faint green in the dimmed compartment. The formation hadn't changed. Whoever those ships belonged to, They were waiting, and something told her they weren't waiting for the Reagan. They were waiting for her. Clara leaned forward slightly, letting her feet rest flat on the floor, spine straight. It was a posture she used during pre-launch briefings. It made her feel anchored. The hum of the room, the light, the vibration of the ship beneath her boots. Those were constants. But inside her, something else had started ticking. A countdown, a memory, a sense that something buried might soon claw its way to the surface. She didn't know what it was, but she knew it started with that scar. The door opened at 07:42 sharp and silent. Two men stepped inside, both in civilian clothes. No insignia, no identification, just hard eyes and neutral expressions. The taller one carried a thin black folder under his arm. The other stood by the door, hands clasped behind his back. Clara didn't move from the metal bench. She gave a curt nod. "Are you going to tell me why I'm here?" The man with the folder took the seat, opposite her. "Let's talk about Operation Silent River." His voice was mild, but his words hit like a cold slap. Clara blinked once, slowly. "I've never heard of that operation." "That's odd," he replied, "because according to this, your name is all over it." He opened the folder and flipped through a few pages, letting her see none of them. She leaned forward slightly, her voice steady. "I have no knowledge of that mission, and I'd like legal counsel before this goes any further." The man near the door let out a short breath that sounded like a laugh. "No need for the hero act. Commander, we're past the part where that works." Clara's jaw tightened. "You're accusing me of something without presenting charges, context, or verification. You want to run this like an intelligence extraction. Fine, but at least admit what this is." The seated man tilted his head, studying her. "You really don't know, do you, that scar of yours? Ever wonder why it never faded?" Clara's hand moved instinctively toward her brow, but stopped halfway. Her breathing slowed, chest rising in precise, shallow motions. The standing man stepped closer, folding his arms. "You've got the look of someone trying very hard not to remember something." Before she could reply, the ship's intercom burst to life with a single, deafening tone. General quarters, general quarters. All hands man your battle stations." The red lights above the door began flashing immediately, casting pulses across the walls. The seated man shut the folder without looking away from her. He stood, glancing at his partner. "We're not done." The standing man hit the lock panel beside the door as they exited. The lock clicked, hard and final. Clara stood slowly and approached the window. Red lights rotated down the corridor. The air outside her cell had changed. Tight, fast-moving, urgent. From her limited view, she could see crew rushing past. Helmets were on, radios clipped to chest rigs, weapons drawn at the ready. Someone shouted in the background, muffled through bulkhead steel. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone carried all the weight of a real threat. She turned from the door and sat again, elbows on her knees, eyes focused on nothing. The words, "Operation Silent River," repeated in her head. Her breathing was calm, but her pulse ticked higher with every second. She didn't know what they wanted from her, but they knew something she didn't. And whatever had just triggered the ship-wide alert, it wasn't routine. Clara stood at the reinforced window. One hand braced lightly against the frame. Outside the glass, the corridor pulsed with red light. The battle station's alarm had gone silent, replaced by the clipped urgency of voices relaying status updates and tactical bearings from where she stood. She could just make out the corner of a radar screen in the adjacent control. Space. The 6 destroyers were still there, holding formation. They hadn't moved an inch since they appeared. Her eyes locked onto the screen, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Behind her brow, just above her right eye, something sharp had begun to bloom. It wasn't pain exactly, more like pressure. A heat building inside the scar, low and deep. She touched it instinctively, fingers resting on the skin. The sensation jumped beneath her touch, almost electric. The room felt tighter suddenly, the light harsher. And then the images came. It wasn't a memory, not the way she understood memory. It was like watching a film spliced with too many frames missing. A dusty tarmac, a row of hangars with markings she didn't recognize, a call sign painted on a fuselage, Valkyrie 1, a man in desert camouflage saying her name, only it wasn't Clara. He called her Eve. She blinked, and it was gone. The heat still pulsed beneath her skin, timed with her heartbeat. She pressed her hand flat to the cool steel of the bulkhead. Focus. This wasn't fear. It was something else. A shift, like gears engaging after years of silence. Her mind drifted to the blood sample, the wristband with the wrong number, the medic who didn't speak, the way the vial was sealed and coded. It hadn't gone to a routine lab. That sample triggered something inside her. She turned back toward the bench but didn't sit. Her movement slowed now, measured. She rolled her shoulders once, reflexively loosening tension. The way she did before briefings or check rides, the scar buzzed again. And this time, a phrase surfaced in her mind. Operation Silent River. She hadn't heard it before today, and yet, she knew it. Not the mission, the feel of it. The architecture of a black file assignment that didn't officially exist. She spoke the name softly, testing it aloud. It didn't feel foreign. It felt buried. She crossed back to the sink, leaned in close to the metal mirror above it. Her eyes looked the same, sharp, gray-blue, steady, but now, something stared back she didn't recognize. Not dangerous, just unfamiliar, like finding someone else's signature written in your own handwriting. Clara Monroe had joined the Navy 17 years ago. At least, that's what the record said. But if something had been altered, if she wasn't who the file claimed, what would she even be? Her breath left in a slow exhale. The destroyers outside, the silence from the bridge, the look on the captain's face before he gave the order. This wasn't an arrest. It was a recovery, and she was the thing they'd come to reclaim. At Airweight 11, the hatch opened without warning. 2 military police stood just outside the doorway. No weapons drawn, no cuffs. Their posture was firm, but different now. One nodded once. Respectful. Commander Monroe, we're escorting you to the bridge. Her name again. Not detainee, not ma'am. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. Clara didn't question it. She stepped forward, straightened her uniform, and followed them out. The corridor was calm, lit with soft amber instead of the jarring red from earlier. Sailors stood aside as they passed, but not out of fear. They watched her like they were waiting for something to make sense, like they'd been told to prepare for a name they couldn't match to a face. The ship vibrated with steady propulsion. No alarms, no alerts, just the low hum of one of the most powerful machines on Earth cruising under. Orders no one had explained. Clara kept her eyes forward. Each step felt like walking deeper into a part of herself that didn't have walls yet. When they reached the bridge, the hatch opened with a hydraulic sigh. Captain Harrington stood near the central console. He didn't speak, didn't motion. He just held out a secure SATCOM handset, already connected. Cord draped over his palm. The rest of the bridge crew pretended not to watch, but every eye tracked her. Clara accepted the phone, pressed it to her ear. The line hissed softly. Then a voice, clipped and mechanical. Please authenticate. Class Echo 6. File designation Deepwater Ash. She didn't think. Her mouth opened, and the words came like muscle memory. Tango Victor 79 Zulu Delta 17 Charlie Foxtrot. Verification phrase breakwater holds. The line paused. The hiss cut. A tone sounded brief, clear, then silence. Clara blinked once, then lowered the phone. The weight of what just left her lips settled slowly across her shoulders. She had never read that phrase. She didn't know that file. But it had come out of her without hesitation, shaped by something deeper than memory. The bridge was quiet. No one moved. Harrington's mouth parted slightly, but he didn't speak. To his right, the comms officer slowly removed his headset. Another sailor at the ops console turned his eyes back to the screen as if, seeing it for the first time. Clara returned the handset to the captain. She didn't ask for answers. Whatever had just shifted wasn't a decision. It had already happened. Something about her had been dormant, locked away, not erased, just waiting. And now, every person on the bridge knew it. Not who she was, but what she might be. At 0826, the bridge fell into a hush as the forward hatch opened. Admiral Michael Rourke stepped inside with measured calm, his presence cutting through the air like a wave. He wore his service khakis, insignia polished but understated. 2 aides followed and remained at the threshold. The admiral didn't speak immediately. He walked to the center console and looked at Clara, standing quietly near the nav station. Rourke turned toward the crew, his voice even at ease. What I'm about to say is no longer classified. It concerns the officer you know as Lieutenant Commander Clara Monroe. He paused. Her real name is Captain Eve Rourke. Embedded intelligence. 8 years under. The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved. No one breathed loudly enough to interrupt the gravity of what they'd just heard. Clara, or Eve, didn't flinch. She met his gaze, something old and silent passing between them. He continued, now walking slowly across the deck. Her arrest this morning was a retrieval protocol, activated when a dormant transmitter in her body was triggered. That transmitter sits under the scar above her right eye. Implanted before insertion, Biochemical activation tied to her blood profile? He gestured to the main display, where the 6 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers still hovered in formation. Those ships are from her original unit, Task Group Sentinel. Their sole objective was to secure her position the moment activation was confirmed. Rourke turned to the rest of the bridge. I understand this is difficult to reconcile. Many of you served under her, questioned her decisions, followed her lead without knowing the full scope. She operated at levels none of you were cleared to see, because that was the point. She wasn't assigned here. She was embedded, and she completed her mission. Captain Harrington stepped back, folding his arms. His expression had shifted. Less confusion now, more clarity. A petty officer near the comm station quietly stood straighter. The ops officer beside her removed his cover. The XO looked to Rourke and then back to Clara. One by one, without order, the crew on the bridge rose to attention. No command issued, no call to stand. It just happened, as if some part of them had already known there was more to her than she ever let on. Admiral Rourke faced her fully now. Welcome back, Captain. You held the line longer than anyone had the right to ask. He didn't salute. She didn't either. But there was no mistaking the weight of respect that passed between them. Clara nodded once, steady and quiet. Then the moment held, deep and still, and the bridge, once filled with doubt, stood ready to follow her again. This time, for who she really was. At 08:49, the door to the secured briefing room closed behind Admiral Rourke with a soft click. Eve sat on one side of a stainless steel table, arms folded loosely, her posture more relaxed than it had been in days. Rourke took the seat across from her without ceremony. Between them lay a slim folder, marked with black tape and no label. He didn't open it right away. Instead, he studied her face for a moment. You always carried yourself like you didn't belong in the uniform. That made you perfect. Eve said nothing, but her eyes narrowed slightly. Rourke tapped the folder once. Your identity was built off a real officer. Clara Monroe, KIA in Afghanistan. Helicopter crash. We used her record, her timeline, reconstructed just enough of her life to be traceable but not reachable. Eve nodded slowly. That much had started to settle in. The gaps in her memory weren't gaps anymore. They were walls, purpose-built. He continued. The memory suppression wasn't full, just structured. Key operational anchors removed. Emotional trauma preserved for realism. That scar entry point for the subdermal array. Designed to activate with a biochemical signal, the blood draw was the switch. She rubbed the side of her temple once, grounding herself. I remember being in Bahrain, but I never deployed to CENTCOM. That was the overlap, wasn't it? He gave a short nod. That's where Eve Rourke disappeared, and Clara Monroe stepped into her place. He opened the folder and slid a photo across the table. 3 men in dress whites, 2 of them circled in red. Rear Admiral Kyler Shaw, Brigadier General Paul Trent, both detained within the last 72 hours. Based on your logs, your comms monitoring at Yokosuka, your filtered dispatch traffic, you've done more from inside than some entire teams do outside. Eve picked up the photo, stared at it without speaking. She recognized their faces now. She'd passed them in corridors, sat behind them in briefings. They'd never looked twice at her. That had been the whole point. Invisible inside the system. Rourke leaned back, folding his arms. Silent River was never about a single takedown. It was network dismantling. You were the node we built everything around, embedded at operational level. Trusted but peripheral. Not too high, not too low. She raised an eyebrow. Just credible enough to be ignored. Exactly, he said, and now we're in final phase. The network's collapsing. The destroyers are here for exfil. You'll be transferred to the Arcadia by 16-0. Decompression starts tomorrow. We'll begin restoration of your full memory sequence then. Eve exhaled slowly. It wasn't relief. It wasn't fear. It was the quiet space left behind when everything heavy falls into place. She looked up. What happens to Clara Monroe? Rourke's voice was softer now. She served. She did what was asked. You don't have to carry her anymore, but you'll always have her discipline. That was you too. Eve nodded once, not out of habit, but out of understanding. The mission was almost over, but the truth had only just begun. Admiral Rourke didn't speak right away. He pulled a photo from the folder. One corner creased from time. It showed a woman in a flight deck jersey, goggles pushed to her forehead, smiling in the sun. That's the real Clara Monroe, he said quietly. Lieutenant Commander, Flight Ops. She was one of ours. Eve took the photo without a word. There was a familiarity in the woman's posture. The straight spine, the squared shoulders, but her smile was different, lighter, unburdened. Rourke continued. She died during a black operation off the Paracel Islands. 3 years ago, vessel went down. No recovery, no remains, just a signal loss and silence. Her record was sealed, then reconstructed. Pieces shifted, details reassigned. She became the shell we used to carry you in. You wore her life, her title, her habits, and you made them real. Eve nodded once. Slowly, a heaviness settled in her chest, not guilt but reverence. She had taken the woman's name without knowing her, but now that name felt sacred. She traced the edge of the photo with her thumb. The woman had given everything, and somehow, her legacy had continued through Eve. A life borrowed, but not wasted. Eve's voice was low. She deserved more than a file. Rourke met her eyes. She got you. And that may have been more than any of us expected. Eve folded the photo gently and slipped it into her breast pocket. Not out of duty, but because the woman in the image deserved to be carried. At 10:03, the call came over the ship's intercom. Attention on deck. Captain Eve Rourke departing. The words were crisp, measured, and carried across every compartment of the USS Ronald Reagan. Out on the flight deck, under a clear Pacific sky, sailors formed a quiet corridor stretching from the island tower to the edge of the landing zone. The rotors of the SH-60 Seahawk pulsed in a steady rhythm, waiting with doors open and engines hot. Eve stepped out of the island passage wearing her full Navy service uniform. Captain's insignia gleamed on her collar. The ribbons were hers now, earned under 2 names. Her posture was quiet, composed. The weight of the moment settled in her frame without resistance. She walked slowly, her boots clicking softly on the non-skid surface of the deck. Heads turned as she passed. Each sailor raised their hand in salute, holding it until she moved beyond. She passed the catapult track where she'd spent countless hours logging flight. Cycles as Clara Monroe. The smell of hydraulic fluid and jet fuel hit her like muscle memory. No sounds but the rotors, the wind, and the respectful silence of a crew that had once questioned her, and now honored her without hesitation. Halfway to the helicopter, Ensign Ramirez stood at parade rest, his shoulders squared with a stiffness only recent commission could bring. He looked like he hadn't slept since the morning started. She stopped in front of him. He opened his mouth, but she raised a hand before he could speak. You followed protocol. Ensign, that's what keeps people alive out here. You did your job. His posture shifted, not relaxed, but relieved. Yes, ma'am. Thank you. She gave a small nod, then placed a hand on his arm for just a second before continuing toward the helicopter. The bridge speakers carried the final announcement as she reached the bird. Captain Rourke is departing the Ronald Reagan under full honors. Across the deck, the sailors braced to attention again. The side crew chief gave her a brief nod as she stepped inside. She didn't look back, not because there was nothing left to see, but because everything she needed had already happened. As the Seahawk lifted off, its shadow passed over the ship, long and slow. Below, the sailors remained still, watching her rise into the sky. For years, she had walked among them as someone else. Now, she left as herself, whole, seen, and finally free. At 14:00 sharp, the secure briefing room inside the Pentagon stood silent as the Secretary of the Navy approached the podium. Eve Rourke stood at attention in her full dress whites, posture flawless, eyes steady. The sound of cameras clicking was muffled behind security glass. Only a few dozen people were present, all cleared, all involved. Most had known her only by code name. Some hadn't known her at all. The secretary read from the commendation, voice strong but measured. Acts of unparalleled bravery, years of unbroken silence, strategic sacrifices made without recognition. He pinned a silver star beneath the row already on her chest, then placed a Navy Intelligence Service ribbon beside it. A pause followed. Not long, just enough to let the room absorb what had finally been made public. There was applause, controlled, formal. Rourke smiled out of reflex. It was what the moment asked for. But as the clapping faded, her gaze drifted toward the window along the east wall. Beyond the Potomac, the city moved as if none of this had ever happened. She let the silence settle around her again. 8 years of buried orders, of missed phone calls, of never sending a birthday card to her niece in Denver because Clara Monroe didn't have a niece. She had written reports over coffee while processing grief no one knew she carried, grief she didn't even fully understand until now. She had walked through deployments and deaths and intelligence briefings with a name that was never hers to begin with. Behind her, officers from 3 branches stood in quiet respect. Some smiled, some didn't. They understood what this meant, but not what it cost. Eve placed a hand gently over the medals now fixed to her chest. The weight was different than she expected. Not heavier, just more real. She took one last look over the Potomac. The mission was done. The file would close, but parts of Clara Monroe would always remain inside her. She owed her that much. Then Eve turned back to the room, nodded once, and walked forward. The ceremony wasn't for her. It was for what she represented. And today, she would carry that weight with honor. At 1743, the gates of Arlington stood quiet in the long shadows of evening. The air held a stillness that didn't ask for silence. It simply expected it. Eve walked slowly across the soft grass, her white dress uniform sharp against the earth tones around her. The sound of her polished shoes softened in the trimmed gravel along the path. She carried no security, no aid, just a small bouquet of white lilies tied with plain navy ribbon. She had checked the location 3 times before arriving, though she knew it by heart. Section 60, Row J, Grave, 1274. Lieutenant Commander Clara Monroe. There was a modest headstone, clean and simple, marked with her rank, her branch, and the date she died. No body had ever returned, but the Navy had placed the marker to honor the service and the sacrifice. Eve stood in front of the grave for a long time before moving. The wind stirred gently through the trees. Flags on nearby markers fluttered against marble. She knelt carefully, set the flowers at the base, and traced the name carved into the stone. Her hand lingered there, not out of guilt, out of something deeper, respect, recognition. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely audible, "for the name, for the weight, for letting me carry it when it mattered." She remained kneeling, eyes closed for a moment, not praying, just being still with the truth of it all. The life she'd borrowed wasn't a fabrication. It had roots. It had parents, a childhood, a family that mourned someone who never came home. Eve had lived under that name for so long. She had nearly forgotten it had once belonged to a woman who laughed, who loved, who served on her own terms. Footsteps approached softly behind her. She turned without rising. A man and woman stood just off the path. The man wore a dark windbreaker with a navy patch on the chest. The woman held a photo in her hand. They looked older than she expected. "We saw you from the road," the woman said quietly. "We weren't sure you'd come." Eve rose slowly, nodding. "I wasn't sure either, but I had to." The man stepped forward, eyes glassy. "You're the one who carried her name, aren't you?" "Yes, sir, I was the one. I tried to honor her with it." They didn't ask questions. They didn't press for stories. The woman stepped closer and reached out, touching Eve's arm gently. "She would have liked you. You have her posture. Stubborn, straight as a flagpole." Eve gave a soft smile. She deserved to be remembered by more than a file. "I may not have known her, but I carried her every day." The 3 of them stood there as the sun dipped lower over the trees. Then they sat together on the stone bench nearby, and for a time, they talked about Clara, about service, about what it meant to disappear for something greater than yourself. The Monroes told stories Eve had never heard, stories that made her laugh, one that made her eyes sting. And in each word, Clara's presence became something real again, not just a name on a mission plan. When dusk fell and the shadows stretched across the lawn, Eve stood once more. She stepped to the marker, straightened her uniform, and gave one final salute. This time, it wasn't protocol. It was goodbye. She turned toward the path as the breeze caught the edge of her cover, lifting it just slightly. The Monroes didn't follow. They stood together by the grave, watching her walk away. Eve didn't look back. She didn't need to. The weight she had carried all those years had shifted. It hadn't disappeared, but it no longer belonged to her alone. Now it rested with those who remembered Clara as she truly was, and with the woman who had carried her memory forward in silence, one mission at a time. At 07:14, the sun cleared the horizon behind the docks at Naval Base San Diego. The water shimmered in gold and steel, broken only by the silhouette of the USS Jackson, her sharp lines cutting a clean profile against the pier. A literal combat ship wasn't flashy, but it was quick, modular, and mission-ready. Just what Eve wanted. Just what she needed. She stepped aboard in full working uniform, cover snug under her arm. The topside watch called attention as she crossed the brow. Her name hadn't been spoken aloud yet. Not by this crew, but they all knew. She paused at the top of the gangway and looked forward, toward the bridge. The hum of systems below deck vibrated faintly under her boots. Commander Vance stood just inside the hatch. He looked older, but only in the eyes. The rest of him still carried that same coiled energy from the Okinawa days. He offered a short nod, no smile. "Ma'am, welcome aboard." Eve nodded back, slipping her cover under her arm. Good to be home. The bridge was tighter than what she was used to, but efficient. Stations stacked in clean angles, displays running diagnostics, no wasted movement. She stepped up to the con, watching as her new officers stiffened instinctively. Helm, engineering, combat systems, all waiting, quiet, focused. She looked to Vance. You've run her through sea trials twice, ma'am. She's ready. Eve turned to the helm. Bring engines to standby. Ready to maneuver. The young ensign gave a sharp eye. Ma'am, hands already dancing across the touch console. She let the sound of readiness fill the space. That crisp exchange of motion and order, the rhythm she hadn't realized she missed. Eve's eyes scanned the bridge once more, resting on each crew member, taking their measure without a word. She stepped forward. All stations report status. Communications ready. Engineering green. Navigation confirmed. Combat systems standing by. One by one, the answers came back clean and solid. Eve straightened, her voice steady. Take us out at standard speed. Aye, Captain. Lines cast off. Engines responded with a low surge. The hull shifted beneath their feet, slow but certain. The Jackson eased away from the pier, heading out into open water. Outside, the wind picked up as the ship cleared the breakwater. Inside, no one spoke unnecessarily. Vance stood beside her at ease. She glanced his way. You ever think we'd end up back on the same deck? He gave the faintest shrug. Thought you'd be buried in a black site or behind a desk. But here we are. Eve let out a small breath through her nose. Not quite a laugh, not quite agreement. She looked out over the bow as the shoreline fell behind them. The sea opened wide, and for the first time in years, the course ahead felt entirely hers. They were underway. And this time, every part of her was coming with. The sea was calm, not flat, not still, just calm in that way. You only understand after years of watching it from a steel deck. Captain Eve Rourke stood at the edge of the bridge, arms folded behind her back. The USS Jackson cut forward at standard speed, engines humming steady beneath her boots. The water peeled away in long, slow arcs as the coast faded behind them. She didn't think about what she'd lost anymore. The time couldn't be reclaimed. The lies couldn't be undone. But they had served their purpose. The silence, the cover stories, the borrowed name, all of it had protected something greater. Not glory, not even country, just people. Lives that kept moving because someone like her had stayed hidden. She thought about Clara Monroe, the real one, not the uniform, not the record. The woman who once laughed on a flight deck and never came home. Eve had worn her name like armor for 8 years. Now she carried it differently. Not out of duty, out of respect. There was a stillness inside her now. Not peace, exactly, but something close. The kind that only comes when you face the truth and live to walk away. The kind earned through things that can't be told over coffee or pinned in a citation. Her voice would never carry in history books. Most of her work would never be declassified. But that didn't matter. She knew who she was. She knew what she'd done. And for the first time in years, that was enough. She stepped to the center line and gave a small nod to the helm. Stay on course. The young sailor responded without hesitation. Aye, Captain. Out ahead. The ocean stretched wide and blue and quiet. There were no orders waiting, no signals to chase, just horizon. In her mind, the words came quietly, like a whisper carried from somewhere deep. Some service leaves no medal, some names vanish with the file, but we keep sailing, and that's enough. The USS Jackson pressed forward, and the sea accepted her without question.